Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This will be our lesson for Sunday, June the 5th. We're starting a new unit of study, so for the next 3 months we're going to be studying in 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings originally were one book in the Hebrew Old Testament, as were 1st and 2nd Samuel. And then when the Greek translation of the Old Testament occurred, the Septuagint, in about 150 BC, they joined Samuel and Kings together and made one bigger book that covered all the period of Israel's kings. That one big book was divided into 4 sections, and so later in our English Bible, those 4 sections became 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Traditionally, Jeremiah has been identified as the author of 1st and 2nd Kings. In modern scholarship, there's been a suggestion that perhaps it was a compilation process later on there, but conservative scholars still continue to endorse the traditional view that Jeremiah wrote the book of the Kings. So in 1st and 2nd Kings, we're going to cover a period of about 400 years from the death of David down to the end of the kings of Israel and Judah. And the author's focus is on the spiritual successes and failures in Israel's history. And so it'll be a very interesting study. 1st Kings begins with a detailed count of the era of Solomon's reign from about 971 to 930, a period of a little more than 40 years. And that's in the first 11 chapters of 1st Kings. This week's lesson, we're going to cover the first 4 chapters of that, and our focus is going to be on chapter 3, a familiar passage. Our lesson's entitled Granted. God offers wisdom to people who ask Him. In the first 2 chapters, like I say, we're going to focus on chapter 3, the first 15 verses. But in the first 2 chapters, David's near the end of his life, and his health is diminishing and deteriorating daily. And so his death is imminent. And naturally, it was assumed that one of David's sons would become the next king. But David had not publicly announced anyone as king. Privately, he had told Bathsheba that Solomon would be the next king, but he hadn't made a public pronouncement of that. And in that absence of any public pronouncement, Solomon's brother, Adonijah, convinced some of Israel's key leaders to give him their support, and he kind of assumed the mantle of leadership there, and he began to celebrate the victory. The old prophet Nathan, who had been so instrumental in David's reign, came to Bathsheba, and she went to, along with Nathan, went to David. And finally, David proclaimed Solomon as his successor. He warned Solomon that there was trouble on the horizon there. He warned him, first of all, to beware of Joab. Joab was the commander of Israel's army under David, and he was fiercely loyal to David. He was David's nephew, but he had shown an unfortunate tendency to kind of take matters into his own hands. When David's son Absalom rebelled, Joab killed Absalom in spite of the fact that David had made it clear that he wanted his life to be spared. He had also murdered 2 generals, Abner and Amasa, and he had joined in Adonijah's conspiracy here to take the throne. David also warned Solomon about Shemiah, one of Saul's ancestors, who had some designs on restoring Saul's family to the throne. Ultimately, Solomon prevailed over those who schemed against him, and you can read all about that in the first 2 chapters. It's a very interesting passage, but it was there was a high price to be paid for solidifying his position as king. Adonijah was executed after he tried to manipulate Bathsheba into helping him in his quest to gain the throne. Joab was executed, and Benaiah replaced him as the commander of the army. Abiathar, the high priest during David's reign, was replaced by Zadok, so the cast of characters here, the positions in leadership in Israel, changed dramatically. In all this maneuvering, Solomon, it appears, kind of remained in the background. He let Nathan and Bathsheba, and Zadok the priest, Benaiah the warrior, be the principal figures that secured the throne for him. And that's kind of significant, because when Solomon assumed the throne, the people of Israel soon learned that he's not David. They're vastly different individuals. David was the warrior king, and he led his army in subjugating the peoples around him. Solomon is more of a scholar, and he, instead of fighting, he made alliances by marriage. That's why he had 700 wives there. He was more interested in building than fighting battles, and so we'll see Solomon in his role as builder. David enjoyed the simple life of a shepherd, but Solomon chose to live in luxury, and he's noted for his luxury. Both of them were poets and wrote songs. We have many of David's psalms recorded for us. Solomon is better known for his Proverbs. So, as we go into chapters 3 and 4 here, they describe the events that occurred during the first 3 years of Solomon's reign, before he started building the temple. And we're going to see Solomon in these chapters in at least 3 roles. If you look at verse 1, it says Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. So here we see Solomon in his role as peacemakers rather than the warrior that David was. His name comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. And during his time as king, Israel enjoyed peace with the countries around them there. And while David had risked his life on the battlefield to defeat these enemy nations, Solomon took the approach of making marriages here. And we see the first of these in verse 1. Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. It's significant that he married Pharaoh's daughter, because in previous times, Egypt, as a strong nation, didn't marry off the daughters to foreign leaders. And so this kind of indicates the decline of Egypt here as a power for a time. So this is part of who Solomon was. And unfortunately, we know that it had some tragic consequences. Moses, in the law, warned the Jewish kings not to marry multiple wives. Deuteronomy 17:17. He must not acquire many wives for himself, so that his heart won't go astray. The latter part of the first verse describes Solomon as the builder, and in subsequent weeks we'll delve into this more deeply, because Solomon's remembered as the king who built the temple, but he also built his own palace, and as it describes here, this wall around Jerusalem. He strengthened it and finished building it. In verse 2, it says, "Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places, because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days." The temple had not yet been built. And however, indicates that although conditions were generally good, this is a matter of concern. The high place, the practice of sacrificing at the high places. These were places that were part of pagan worship, and Israel was specifically forbidden to utilize pagan high places and altars here. They had once been Canaanite shrines, and even though the Israelites worshiped the Lord at these high places, they often sinned by blending the worship of the false gods with their worship of the Lord. And that's exactly why Moses had addressed this issue. Verse 3 begins, verses 3 through 15. We see Solomon as the worshiper. We've seen him as the peacemaker, the builder, and now in these verses we see him as the worshiper. And verse 3 tells us that he got off to a good beginning. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. A good beginning doesn't guarantee a good ending. And the except in verse 3 is significant. It's worth taking the time to consider in our own lives, in a moment of introspection, what might be the excepts in our own lives. Solomon loved the Lord, walked in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. In his sermon last Sunday, Brother Mike, preaching from Deuteronomy 4, 1 through 9, pointed out that the Lord instructed the Israelites to guard their hearts, to be very careful about what they placed in the treasure box of their heart, the illustration he used. And he strongly emphasized that we choose what we hang on to and what we get rid of. Sadly, Solomon chose to keep worshiping in these high places. So, all of that's free. We're now ready to start the lesson. So let's look at verses 4 and 5. "Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, 'Ask, what shall I give you?'" Solomon, after he became king, he went to Gibeon to sacrifice there. And in 1 Kings verse 4, chapter 1 verse 4, it describes it as the great high place. 2 Chronicles 1, 2, and 3 gives us a little bit more information. It tells us that Solomon and his whole assembly with him went to the high place that was in Gibeon, and they went there because God's tent of meeting, which the Lord's servant Moses had made in the wilderness, was there. David had brought the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim to the place he had set up for it because he had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. So the Ark of the Covenant's in Jerusalem, but the tent of meeting is still in Gibeon here. And the bronze altar, which Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, had made, was in front of the Lord's tabernacle. So this bronze altar and the tent of meeting are in Gibeon. Solomon and the assembly inquired of God there. And Solomon offered sacrifices there in the Lord's presence on the bronze altar at the tent of meeting, and he offered 1,000 burnt offerings here. Gibeon's a little bit northwest of Jerusalem. I saw estimates from 3.5 to 6 miles. It's a little bit northwest of Jerusalem. The 1,000 burnt offerings indicates that this was a special, important occasion, and the purpose was to offer thanks to God for establishing Solomon as king, and also to ask God's blessing on his reign. And so while Solomon was at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream. And his appearance to Solomon in this dream indicates that God had received the sacrifices and was prepared to bless and honor Solomon and do great things with him. And in the dream, God said to Solomon, "Ask, what shall I give you?" When you think about it, that's a pretty awesome thing, isn't it? God came to Solomon and said, "Ask." And the inference there is that you can ask for anything you want here. So you choose what you'll ask for. Let's see what David asked for. Let's look at verses 6 through 9. And Solomon said, "You've shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David. But I'm a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you've chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted." So the first thing Solomon did in response to God here, saying, "What shall I give you?" was to review the past and thank God for the faithfulness and the love that he had shown his father. He acknowledged God's goodness in keeping his father through many trials, and now in giving him a son to inherit the throne. And what he's specifically making reference to there is the covenant that God made with David when he expressed his heart's desire. David expressed his heart's desire to God to build the temple for him back in 2 Samuel 7. And in that covenant, God promised David a son who would build the temple. And now Solomon is the fulfillment of that. So he admits here, he acknowledges that he wasn't the king because of his abilities, but because God kept his promises to his father David. Solomon recognized that he was attempting to fill not only the shoes but the throne of David. And as we'll see, he recognized he was totally inadequate for the job. In verse 7, he describes himself as only a little child. You have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I'm a little child, he said. Now, why would David call himself a little child? He's about 20 years old at this time, most scholars feel like, and he had very little experience. So labeling himself a little child was an honest admission on his part that he didn't have the knowledge and experience that he needed to govern a nation. So he was self-aware enough to know this. And so it's with a spirit of humility that he stresses his youth and inexperience. And he uses an idiom there. I do not know how to go out or come in. And that expression was a common expression of the day, apparently, that emphasized someone's inexperience here. The second thing we see is in verse 8, he's very conscious that the people of Israel are God's people, and he's God's servant. The terms your people and your servant are used 3 times each in verses 7 through 9. So Solomon confessed his inexperience, but also the nation's greatness. The people of Israel were the people of God, and that meant that God had a great purpose for them to fulfill, and as king, he had a great responsibility in ruling them and enabling them to carry out and fulfill God's purpose. Those words there, a great people too numerous to be numbered or counted, reflect the promise of God to Abraham back in Genesis 13:16, when God said to Abraham, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. So God had greatly blessed and increased Abraham's people in stature and numbers. Verse 9, Solomon gets to his request here. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who's able to judge this great people of yours? So he concludes here his prayer by asking the Lord for the wisdom he needed to rule the nation. He asked for an understanding heart, literally a hearing heart. And the phrase suggests not only the willingness and patience to listen to all sides of an issue, but the desire for the ability to reason here. Solomon had succeeded David, Israel's greatest king. And so that's an awesome task for such an inexperienced leader. And so he knew he could not accomplish that great responsibility without wisdom from heaven. So he asked for an understanding mind with which to rule the people. The grammar there, the words, carries the idea of judging and justice. And that's in keeping with the fact that in Israel, the king was the final court of appeal, was personally responsible for the promotion of justice. So in Psalm 72, 1 through 4, the psalmist prays, endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. He will judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. He will defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the needy. He will crush the oppressor. That picture is also an important part of Isaiah's picture of the ideal king who's coming. In Isaiah 11, 3 through 5, his delight will be in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes. He will not execute justice by what he hears with his ears, but he will judge the poor righteously, execute justice for the oppressed of the land, He will strike the land with discipline from his mouth. He will kill the wicked with a command from his lips. Righteousness will be a belt around his loins. Faithfulness will be a belt around his waist. Warren Wiersbe points out in his commentary that wisdom is not a theoretical idea. It's not an abstract commodity. It's very practical and personal. And as he says, many people are smart enough to make a good living, but they're not wise enough to make a good life. A life of fulfillment that honors the Lord. So Solomon asked for wisdom from the Lord. Let's see how God responded to that. God provides in 1 Kings 3:10 through 15. The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And then God said to him, because you've asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And then Solomon awoke, and indeed it had been a dream, and he came to Jerusalem, and he stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, offered up burnt offerings, offered peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. So God was pleased with Solomon's response. He was pleased that Solomon had asked this thing. It showed that Solomon was concerned with serving God. And he was concerned with serving his people by knowing and doing God's will. Solomon bypassed the kind of request that most people would commonly make. He didn't ask for prosperity, or he didn't ask for a long life, victory over enemies, all of those things that God acknowledges in verse 11. But rather you've asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. And so God answered Solomon's request in abundant measure, gave him not only an understanding heart, but one that was wise for handling the life, the affairs in Israel in a fair and skillful manner. And as we'll see, the abilities that God gave to Solomon were extraordinary. He sought the more essential things, and because of this, God promised him that the wisdom that he sought would stand alone among men. Verse 13 is interesting. I've also given you what you've not asked, both riches and honor. Because Solomon chose a greater gift than riches and honor, God promised him everything else as well. And that just illustrates the truth of what Jesus said in Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. Now Solomon never read Matthew 6:33, but he practiced it here, and the Lord gave him the additional blessings that he didn't ask for. God always gives his best to those who leave the choice with him. When you read the book of Proverbs, you find that the love of wisdom and the practice of discernment can lead to these extra blessings. Proverbs 3:1 and 2, My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands, for they will bring you many days of full life and well-being. Verses 13 through 18, Happy is a man who finds wisdom and acquires understanding, for she is more profitable than silver, and her revenue is better than gold. She's more precious than jewels. Nothing you desire compares with her. Long life is in her right hand, in her left riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant, and all her paths peaceful. She's a tree of life to those who embrace her, and those who hold on to her are happy. Verse 14, God reminds Solomon of his continuing responsibility to walk faithfully before him. If you walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days, God promises here. When Solomon woke up, he realized indeed it's been a dream, and he's very much aware that God has spoken to him in that dream. And so he returned to Jerusalem, where the Ark of the Covenant is, and he brought burnt offerings and fellowship offerings there. In doing that, Solomon was expressing his thanks for God's goodness. And he brought his officials together for a feast so that they could rejoice in this thanksgiving here. In the rest of chapter 3, we have that very familiar story. God had granted Solomon wisdom. And in the remainder of chapter 3, you remember the story of the two women who gave birth to sons very close together, and one son died. And then there was confusion about who was the mother of the remaining son, and they quarreled about that. And they brought their quarrel to Solomon to resolve. And he said, "Bring me a sword." And he said, "I'll divide the child in half and give half to each." Well, the mother was horrified by this and said, "No, give the child to the other woman." By this, Solomon knew who the mother really was. And so he was greatly acknowledged for his wisdom. Chapter 4 gives some details about Solomon's administration and those changes. We talked about some of those. Benaiah replaced Joab as the commander of the army. Zadok replaced Abiathar as the priest. And there's other information about the structure of the government. But down in 1 Kings 4:29, it tells us God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. So Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, Chalcol, Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish, and men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth, who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Solomon was granted his request. He was smart enough, he was wise enough to ask God for wisdom, and God granted it to him. And for us, it reminds us of what James said in James 1:5. If you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. And he will not rebuke you for asking. The first 6 verses, the 2nd chapter of Proverbs, one of my favorite passages in all the Scripture. And in that passage, Solomon talks about the pursuit of wisdom. And there's a formula there that we can all learn from. He says, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding. Yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding. If you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. So, just like Solomon, we have the opportunity to ask God for wisdom. And we have instruction about how to acquire that wisdom. I like the progression in that passage. He says, if you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding. The word picture there is of an animal in the wild with his ears pricked up. He's alert for all of his surroundings. So our first step is to be alert to the opportunities to gain and acquire wisdom. But that's not enough. Verse 3 says, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, so you actively seek it, you pursue it, you seek out and cry out for those opportunities. And then verse 4, if you seek her as silver and search for her as hidden treasures, that just ramps up the progression, because the treasure hunter spends a lot of time preparing and researching and seeking out. If we do those things, then you'll understand the fear of the Lord, find the knowledge of God, and the Lord will give us wisdom. So this is a good lesson that has a powerful message for all of us there. Come back next week and we'll move on and look at some of Solomon's building, I believe. Thank you.